So now that we've talked about all of our theories of motivation, I want to get into a practical application. And as promised, we're going to talk about hunger and weight regulation, which is a pretty nice way to wrap up all of the things that we've talked about with a couple of examples of how, say, diets disprove a lot of our theories, or not necessarily disprove, but go against the theories of motivation. And so we're going to get into, well then, how does hunger and weight regulation actually work? And so we're going to consider hunger as a motive. And so we've already mentioned that this is one of those basic biological drives. The drive to find and consume sustenance gives you the energy to do all of the other activities that you do. So this is something that's essential and critical to survival. So this is very highly affected by something like, say, natural selection. So we can talk about the biology side of it, providing a push. So that's the drive theory, where when you're hungry, you're going to partake in behaviors that allow you to go and get the food that you need, that push towards obtaining food. But we also have this psychology side, where the anticipation and expectation of the flavors of the food provide that pull, that incentive to eat. And so we get a little bit of a push and a pull, drive and incentive theories coming together, along with a bunch of other things as well. And so we're going to start with the biology side of things, and we're going to talk about the physiology of hunger, of what's specifically going on within our bodies that's driving the cycle of eating food and breaking it down and getting energy from it and then getting hungry again. So the first key concept is metabolism. And when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about the rate at which your body uses energy. And for bodies using energy, the unit that we use are calories. So a calorie is a unit of energy, just like a joule or similar would be, if you're talking about other kinds of forms of energy. We also care about our basal metabolism. So this is our resting metabolism, or base cell operation energy consumption. So how much energy is your body consuming without doing all of the extra things? So even if you don't go for a walk or go to the gym or do something active, you're still going to burn quite a lot of calories just by keeping your body functioning. And so that energy goes towards giving energy to your cells to provide all of your daily needs. So for your digestive tract to be activated, for your brain to function. And when we talked about the chapter where we mentioned the brain and how brain function is, the brain is a resource hog. So not only does it take tons of our oxygen and take a lot of our blood supply, it also takes a ton of our energy use. So a lot of this basic functioning uses energy, and about 2/3 of our normal energy use just comes from keeping our bodies running. The rest, that 1/3, is what we use when we're actually doing things, when we're walking around, when we're having conversations. That's extra energy above and beyond just maintaining our bodies. So the basal metabolism is actually most of our energy consumption on a given day. And so continuing on with this physiology of hunger, we want to talk about two basic mechanisms for maintaining our energy homeostasis. And maintaining an energy homeostasis just means that we have enough energy available within our bodies for everything to function, for our cells to work, to keep that basal metabolism fed. So you don't want to have too much energy, but you also don't want to have too little. And so we can look at these in terms of short-term and long-term solutions. So short-term is when we talk about sort of right now, immediately, how can I fix an energy deficit or over expenditure? And so these short-term signals will indicate mostly our hunger and satiety or fullness. So if you're hungry, you eat. If you're full, you stop eating. So it's going to dictate when and how we eat our meals. So how much food are you having right now, and when are you going to eat it? Very short-term stuff. When we look at long-term, the long-term signals are going to start adjusting appetite and overall metabolism. And so this is going to balance out our long-term over or under eating from our short-term signals. So if you end up not eating enough food over long periods, then your body will adjust and maybe increase your appetite so that you eat more to allow you to have enough energy. And these long-term signals tend to be based on body fat. So if you have lots of fat built up in your body, then you're probably overeating or under-burning calories. And so you don't need to be consuming as much. You don't need to bring as much energy in because you already have fat stores. And fat is going to be reserves that we can burn for energy later. And so we're going to use these terms, short and long term. Short term just meaning immediately effective, things like meals, and long term is that longer, averaged over long times for appetite and metabolism. And so one clear distinction that we need to make is the fact that our eating patterns aren't necessarily linked to immediate energy needs. And so a lot of people have this common misconception that you start eating food because you're out of energy and you need that energy to function. Or you stop eating food because you've reached the point where you have enough energy. But that's not actually the case. If we think about this from an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't make sense to wait until you're at the last reserves of energy in your body to go seeking food. For humans nowadays, it's not a huge problem for most of us because if you were deathly hungry, you just wander to your fridge and get some food. But for a lot of people and for other species, that's not the case. They'd have to go and find food, hunt food, gather food. So it doesn't evolutionarily make sense to wait until the very last minute. So you're not eating because you've run low on energy. You're eating because you don't want to run low on energy. You want to maintain that buffer of energy available to you. So you're just going to eat when you would need to eat to maintain your homeostatic balance, but not because you've completely run out of energy. And for the same idea, you don't stop as soon as you've met your energy requirements. Again, evolutionarily speaking, if you're eating something, you might as well finish eating it and store up that extra energy. You don't stop just because you've reached the point where you'd be back in homeostasis. You're going to keep eating so that you can store some up for later. So don't fall for these sort of misconceptions. And these homeostatic mechanisms, this whole setup, is basically designed to prevent us from running low on energy. It's going to keep us within that homeostatic range, and it's going to keep us more or less within functional normal levels. So another important term to talk about when we're describing hunger and body weight and things like that is going to be our set point. And this is a biologically determined physiological standard around which fat mass is regulated, which is a whole bunch of words to basically say this is the point where your body tends to settle. This is our standard weight, our set weight, and this is where we tend to settle based on sort of how much we eat, when we eat, what we eat, and how quickly our body burns the energy from the things that we eat. So if you've ever tried to gain or lose weight, you'll find that it's very difficult to move from the weight that you have stabilized at. People tend to exist at a set point, a set weight, and moving from that point tends to be rather difficult. And so we can talk about the homeostatic mechanisms will alter how we use energy and how much we eat to try and keep us in that range of our set point. So we have that comfortable weight where our body operates optimally and we tend not to move from it. Our set point is basically a homeostatic point for our weight. And you can eventually shift that. Usually if you change, say, your diet and exercise, if you can adjust your metabolism through a lot of effort, you'll usually be able to adjust your set point, but you will have then a new set point at a different weight, and then your body will tend to sit around that weight now. So there's always a point about which our body tries to stabilize. Okay, so that's the basic setup of how this all works. Now we're going to talk about, well, what's going on when we start getting hungry? What are some of the signals that are triggering us to start a meal? So the first of these are hunger pangs, and those are muscular contractions around our stomachs that seem to correlate with feelings of hunger. Interestingly to note, our hunger pangs, those stomach contractions, aren't the cause. They aren't causing us to feel hungry. They just happen to occur at the same time. So you feel hungry and experience hunger pangs at the same time. One is not causing the other. And we know this because people can still experience hunger, and kind of relatedly, they can also feel full even if the nerves that connect our stomach to our brains are severed. So there have been a couple of cases where surgeries have been conducted and the nerves between the stomach and the brain have been damaged. And people who don't have that direct line to the nerves that are measuring how full or empty our stomach is, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's the distension or how stretched your stomach is. But even people who don't have that experience, who have had those nerves cut, they can still feel hungry and they can still feel full. So it's not a direct signal from the stomach that's causing us to feel hungry or full. There's something else going on. So what's the something else? And most of what's causing us to feel hungry is actually a nice predictable cycle, a pattern of increasing and decreasing in the glucose levels in our blood. So glucose is our unit that provides the body energy. So glucose in the blood means that there is energy available circulating throughout our bodies that the cells can pick up and start burning to turn into energy. So this is a food source and energy source. And over time, those blood glucose levels start to drop because our cells are making use of that free-floating glucose. So the liver can convert stored nutrients into glucose. So the liver lets us produce more glucose from stuff that we have stored up. And as it releases more of that stored nutrient, it turns it into glucose and re-releases it. We can sort of make use of that again. But overall, we're going to start losing our stores and we'll run low on having glucose free in our blood. And this cycle, as those levels start dropping, is going to start generating feelings of hunger. We're going to feel hungry because we can detect, we have receptors that are picking up on these dropping glucose levels. And so that's the first thing that starts signaling hunger. The next thing is a peptide called ghrelin. A peptide is just a short chain of amino acids, so it is a small protein. And this peptide is secreted by the stomach and small intestine, so it's secreted by our digestive tract. And it tends to peak, so we have high levels of ghrelin in our bloodstream right before a meal. So as we're getting closer to a meal happening, levels of this peptide, of this protein, build up in our system. And then once we start eating, our ghrelin levels drop. So ghrelin serves as an indicator that it's time for a meal. Okay, so that's starting a meal. Now we can look at, well, how do we know that we're full? How do we stop eating? How do we end a meal? And so we've already talked about one of the indicators, and that's sensing stomach and intestinal distension. So as you eat food, that food travels to your stomach, and your stomach fills up with the food that you're consuming. And so as it fills, the stomach will start to stretch just a little bit. And so we have nerves that surround the stomach that will pick up on how stretched it is and let the brain know that our stomach is distended, that it's full and stretched. And so that can indicate that it's time for us to stop eating because we're full. Though again, we had just talked about people who have these nerves between the stomach and the brain, and those nerves are severed. But people who can't sense this intestinal and stomach distension still feel full. So there's also a chemical component to this. Just like how we had ghrelin and our blood glucose levels, we also have a chemical signal that tells us that we're full, that signals satiety. And so the first one is cholecystokinin, which are cholecystokinin. Oh man, doing really bad at this today. Cholecystokinin. And we shorten it to CCK. So you will see the acronym on any questions that I ask about this one. I'll include the full name because some people are really good with long names, but you'll mostly see it referred to as CCK. So CCK is another peptide, another short amino acid chain or protein, and it's released by the small intestines into the bloodstream, and it travels to the brain to signal that we've eaten. And interestingly, nutrient-rich foods, so foods that have lots of calories stored in it, are going to produce signals of satiety faster than low-nutrient foods. So if you eat something that's very calorie dense, maybe you eat a bunch of peanut butter, that's going to produce these signals that you're full a lot faster than eating something that's low in nutrients, something like celery. So you'd have to eat a lot more celery to start feeling full than you would if you were eating peanut butter. So there's something linking the density of the nutrients in the food we're eating and how quickly CCK is released into our bloodstream. So now we're going to start looking at, instead of starting and ending meals, which are our short-term signals, now we're going to start looking at some of the longer-term signals. And so these are signals that are going to influence our weight and our appetite. And the first of these is called leptin. And leptin is a hormone specifically secreted by fat cells. And so the more fat cells that you have in your body, the more leptin is going to be circulating within your bloodstream. And the higher your leptin levels, the more your brain should be suppressing your appetite. So high levels of leptin cause your brain to signal a decrease in appetite and increase energy expenditure. So you're going to eat less and try and increase your metabolism. And we've studied leptin production and the effects of it in some genetically engineered obese mice. And so actually I'm going to switch to the next slide because these guys are just adorable. So we have this one here on the left, and he is clearly very overweight. So he has lots of fat cells and should be secreting lots of leptin from all of those cells. Whereas this guy on the right has normal levels of fat and doesn't really need to be secreting lots of extra fat, or lots of extra leptin, sorry. And so we've already said these are acting long term. Okay, and so the idea here is, so one of the fat ones should be secreting lots of leptin, but I mentioned that these are genetically engineered obese mice. And so they're genetically engineered specifically to lack leptin. So there's a mutation, a gene knockout, that stops the production of leptin. So even though these organisms have lots of fat cells and should be releasing a lot of leptin, they aren't. And so even as they start gaining weight, they're not getting that signal, that higher levels of leptin that should be telling them to start reducing their appetite, to increase their energy expenditure. And so the mice continue to overeat as though they aren't overweight, and they get fatter and fatter and fatter. But the cool part is that if they then inject these fat mice with leptin, so if they introduce leptin externally, because we just said the mice can't make their own, but if you inject them with leptin, you can artificially restore that homeostatic balance. By injecting leptin, the brains then pick up on the fact that there are high leptin levels, and they'll start sending those signals to reduce the appetite and increase energy expenditure. And so a mouse that is this obese can go back to being this thin through daily injections of leptin. So it can restore that homeostatic balance if we artificially reintroduce the hormone that they are unable to produce because of a mutation. And so that's why we know this is the function of leptin, because we can manipulate whether they do or don't have leptin, and we see the changes in body mass, which is super cool. So this slide here is just a summary of all of the signals that we've looked at so far. The one thing I want to point out is that I'm including neuropeptide Y here, which is a signal that increases hunger. Not because we've talked about it, but because we will be talking about it. And I don't want this chart to be incomplete, so we'll come back to that one in just a minute. But we've talked about glucose, and a drop in our glucose level signals hunger. So as our free-floating levels of glucose in the blood drop, we start feeling hungry. CCK is released by our intestines as we eat, and as it's released, it decreases our hunger. It stops us from eating. Leptin is secreted by fat cells, and it is a long-term signal. That's what the asterisk here is. And it's going to decrease our hunger overall, mostly by helping to decrease our appetite. When we get to it, neuropeptide Y is something secreted by neurons in our brain, and it's going to increase hunger. And then the last one is ghrelin, and that's secreted by our stomach and small intestine, and it's going to increase our hunger because those levels are peaking right before we eat a meal. So that's our Coles notes of all the signals that we've talked about in one place. So now, as promised, we're going to move to the point where we can start talking about the brain areas involved in this whole process. So most of what we know to be involved in weight regulation and hunger and everything like that, most of them are involved or are located in or around the hypothalamus. So in this general area of the brain. And so we have our lateral hypothalamus towards the back. We have the ventromedial hypothalamus towards the bottom here, and this paraventricular nucleus, which will be shortened to PVN, which is what we just saw here as our secretion source of neuropeptide Y. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But like I've said, the structures in the hypothalamus are playing a role in regulating hunger. They also seem to play a role in thirst, sexual arousal, and body temperature. So a lot of very basic or basal biological functions. Because we've already talked about parts of the brain, and we've talked about the hypothalamus before. So we're just bringing it back to talk about the specifics involved in hunger. So our first point is that lateral hypothalamus, this part here towards the back. And we think it's involved in stimulating eating. And you'll notice that these are mostly going to be phrased in "it may be involved" or "we think it's involved." And that's because, as we've said before, the human brain is a complex process. There's lots going on, there's a lot of different moving parts, so it's very hard to be certain of what's happening. All we can do is sort of a best guess. So we think the lateral hypothalamus is involved in stimulating eating, starting meals. And the ventromedial hypothalamus, the part down here in green towards the bottom, that's probably involved in stopping eating. So these would be sort of one direction and then the other to work together to maintain homeostasis of starting and stopping meals. And then the next is that paraventricular nucleus, the PVN, which we pointed out here as the red dot towards the front. And there's receptors in that area for all sorts of neurotransmitters, but for the most part, they seem to be involved in all aspects of eating. So it's stimulating or reducing appetite, and it might be long-term and it might be short-term. So it could be influencing meals sort of in the immediate vicinity, starting and stopping immediate meals, but it could also be increasing and decreasing appetite over the long term. And these aren't mutually exclusive. It doesn't have to be one or the other. This area could be involved in all of those, just influenced by a variety of neurotransmitters, like our neuropeptide Y, which we know acts as an appetite stimulant. So it's going to start you eating. So lots going on in those areas.